Thanks for tuning in to 13 Questions this week. We're sitting here with our good buddy, our fellow podcaster buddy, Gordon White. Anyway, we've had him on the show a couple of times. We're always looking to see what Gordon's up to because it's always interesting. His podcast, Rune Soup, is fantastic. He's definitely a go-to source on magic, occult, and I mean a little bit of everything. So we're happy to have him here today to answer our questions. And we're super excited. Welcome to the show, Gordon.
Thank you very much for the invite.
So we'll jump right into it. We do usually what we do is we'll jump right through the questions, and then at the end of the bonus question segment, that's kind of when we'll leave it open for a bit of free flow chat, kind of like we do on the Grimerica show. And it'll be fun. So
I like the sound of it.
We'll jump right into it. Of course, you had the chance to peruse the questions for a little while before and not catch you fully off guard. But we'll jump right into it with what was the best advice ever given to you, and would you modify it at all today?
Yeah, so it's interesting having the question sent through early, right? Because you get time to think about it. And, I'm not sure in the end life is that difficult. I think, don't be a dick and follow your bliss and then die well, hopefully leaving the planet a little bit better than you found it, which sort of means when it comes to best advice, very often it's almost prosaic, like it's something that doesn't sound to other people's ears really, really wise. It's just that it was a message that happens to appear in your life at the exact time you need it. So for mine, it was my first mentor when I was working at a magazine and newspaper company in New Zealand, and I idolized this woman. She ran the magazine department I worked for, and she was always unbelievably professional and really, really hardworking. And I thought she took her job really seriously and was in love with it. It's a very high status job to be running like a magazine company back when people actually read magazines. And so we were out for drinks one day after work, and she essentially said, it's not going to say on your tombstone that you sold a lot of ads, because I was kind of getting in my head about work and so on. And here's this woman who is unbelievably good at her job and there at 7:30 in the morning and working really hard. And I thought her job was everything to her. And she's like, it's not going to say on your tombstone you sold a lot of ads. And I'm like, wow. So what I learned, that was my lesson, that one, work hard, I guess, but don't get invested in your job because it's not what life's about. And I really thought it was for her. And so that honestly stuck with me. I got that when I was about 22. And the follow-up, would you modify it all today? I mean, to say ads anymore is no longer relevant, right? But otherwise, no. It's a persistent lesson in my life to not sort of intertwine my identity with something like a job, because that changes and it's a very unsatisfactory way to live. So literally, that was the best bit of advice, and it's almost tangential career advice, but that was it, and it stuck with me. So it was in a workplace environment, and that was the best advice I got.
Yeah, and for her to make it not seem that way. Obviously she's very dedicated. Yeah.
That was the bit that, because she was a force, like she's dead, she's not. But like if you worked with her, she was a force of nature and very inspirational and always on point. And you just thought she lived and breathed the job. No, she didn't. Like she had a real proper life outside of it, and when she was at work, she would work, and otherwise that was it. It was just a job, and it's not what life was about. And that's been really useful. That's been a really useful lesson for me, and it kind of reprioritized what I would not just focus my identity on, but also when you're outside of work, do the things that, in fact, are you following your bliss? Don't stay at work for the hell of it. And that was just really helpful, useful advice. And without it, I wouldn't have had almost like the room in my head to do things like start the blog and so on. So it's strange that it's just this offhanded comment at after work drinks, but it was probably the best advice I ever got.
Wow.
Great one. That's words to live by right there. And as far as work goes, I mean, so many people get caught up in their career and just, neglect that'll become more important than family, health, everything else. And that's definitely not a good way to be.
And with a media career, I've been made redundant so many times, but like back when I had proper jobs, and this was really early on in my career. And so every time it would happen, there's the shock of it and whatever. But I would think back to my first mentor's words and be, oh, yeah, whatever, on to the next one. It's not going to say he worked at Discovery Channel on his tombstone either. Like, come on. So it sounds odd, but thinking about it, it's one of those like sneaky bits of best advice. But I'm sure if you like, once you have more of these episodes in the can, you'll be able to have like almost like a catalog or a database of them. And that question one, well, I suspect look very similar. It'll only break down into 2 or 3 categories because I don't think life is that difficult. I just think you get the best advice at the time when the best advice is the thing you need to hear most at that point.
That's right. Absolutely. And a lot of them are like stuff you learn when you're a kid too. Like, I mean, my answer to that question was like, just, treat others the way you want to be treated. And you'll probably, things will be better.
Yeah. See, like I think when we first, for guests who read that first question, it's like, oh God, I need to think of something really clever. Like there's a trick to life, like it's a computer game. And it's in fact, no, you go into the second door and you pick that up first. Like that's not it. The best advice is generally stuff like, don't be a dick. That seems pretty fair.
The stuff you forget in high school. What was the most important lesson you learned from your parents?
This is a good one. And like yourself, going through these questions, it made me realize how much I have, in fact, been influenced by my family from an inspiration perspective. And it's something like self-determination or kind of like a stoicism, and also pick the right co-pilot for life. So my parents' relationship isn't the most loving one. You'll find there's pictures or videos on Twitter of like men in their early 70s at the airport with flowers waiting for their wife to come back after 50 years of marriage and all that. That is absolutely not my parents. My parents, however, they put my father through medical postgraduate school. They started a business, it failed, and it's this kind of like do it yourself, quiet determination, but also pick the right co-pilot for life, because those two combined raised a bunch of kids and had businesses and didn't, and then just quietly do it and don't wail, essentially. Don't wail at the injustices, because if you are fortunate enough to live long, bad things are going to happen to you as well as good things. And if I look back over the kind of my parents' life in aggregate has been very inspirational to me, because I think they did what they needed to do right. And they're retired now, but they're still off adventuring around the world, enjoying their retirement and planning those holidays. And they lean into each other's failures. To be honest, it's mostly my mother leaning into my father's failures, but they have their strengths and weaknesses that round each other out. And as a combined team, they just kind of like doubled down and got on with life. And I like that.
Yeah, that's great. That's like, it's funny how a lot of those answers end up being more indirect than direct. It always seems to be an indirect lesson. It's not like, well, one time my daddy sat me down and he said, don't do drugs. And I never did drugs. I was fortunate enough to have responsible parents. So I had all those talks that was like, don't do drugs, but if you do and get into trouble, let us know. Like my dad was a drug and alcohol psychiatrist before he retired. So he was realistic about what kids got up to. And he's like, don't do it, because definitely don't do heroin and whatever. But don't, if you get high and into trouble, call us and whatever. So I got all those good bits of advice, but they're not as inspirational or less medicinal in aggregate than the actual story of them living their life.
Awesome.
What book has been most influential on your life and why? And it's okay if you want to do more than one. Everyone's done a couple, so.
At the very least, I have to split it into fiction and nonfiction. So fiction is Lord of the Rings without peer and miles away. And I first read it as a child when I was early, I guess, elementary school for North Americans, right? And so, because I was precocious with my reading age, but I still obviously didn't understand a lot of it. And I've read it dozens of times since, of course. And so I don't know if it's the book itself or the fact that it was one of the first things I started to ambitiously read independently, that if I go back in my memory of my childhood, this book and Middle-earth kind of emerges from that gloomy part where your memories start to fade because you were too young. And so it's this strange intertwined at the base of my long-term memories is stuff about Gandalf and hobbits and whatever. But I mean, in general, the reason it's so inspirational, I think, is you can't go through that book without knowing that it is in some sense real. So it forces you to look at what you consider to be the imaginal or the imagination, and how close it is to the surface and what that kind of implies about reality. So it's a book you can, when you read it, you are in it, and you have to confront what that means for you metaphysically. Like it has some kind of reality that if you hadn't read anything like that before, you need to come to terms with. And so it's remarkable. So from a fiction perspective, definitely Lord of the Rings. And it influenced my life in a sense. I joke about this, but it's only half a joke. It is probably one of the factors as to why I first moved to New Zealand in my early 20s anyway. Like I liked Lord of the Rings enough to go, should I move to Middle Earth? Yeah, I'm moving to Middle Earth. That's what's happening. So honestly, it's there's the kind of deep psychological and metaphysical answer, but I can also point to things like I visited Tolkien's grave over a dozen times, and I literally moved to Middle Earth. So from fiction perspective, it's Lord of the Rings. And from a quote-unquote nonfiction, I guess, perspective, it has to be the first two Pete Carroll Chaos Magic books. So it has to be Liber Null and Psychonaut and Liber Chaos, which more or less, it's kind of cheating because it's two of them, but they essentially come together as a pair. And that absolutely, I'd read and played around with magic before I'd found them, which is still fairly early on. I would have been about 14 when I first read them. But that was it for me. That's when I could see that there's a way of being in the world that fits me better than any other ones I'd found. And so far, 20-something years later, that is in fact the case. So Lord of the Rings and Pete Carroll's first two Chaos Magic books.
Nice.
I got to get more magic books in the collection. See, that's another great question that we're going to end up with a fantastic library. We're going to start tracking all the books down, and it'll be the bookshelf.
Oh, good idea. Yeah. Oh, that's excellent. Yeah, I should do that. That's a really good idea.
What daily habits or rituals do you have, and do you recommend them for others?
Well, I definitely don't recommend my daily habits. Goodness. They could be improved. Daily rituals, I definitely do. So each morning in the sort of first planetary hour of the day, which is the sort of first almost an hour after sunrise, I do planetary propitiation or invocation, and that kind of generally smooths out the astrological space weather, and it's just it's a regular prayer practice essentially, and I would recommend that to people who are interested in either astrology or magic, but otherwise, live your best lives. That one is guaranteed it happens, and I would love to say, although it's been a couple of weeks, that I generally do some afternoon meditation rather than morning. And I'd also recommend that on a universal basis. Again, it's not a daily habit because it does slip off the list. The planetary prayer stuff doesn't. But if I lied and said I meditated every day, I would universally recommend that one. And I'd recommend some sort of planetary day acknowledgement if you're going to be involved in things like astrology or magic.
Awesome.
What would that what would that look like in a quick?
It's a whole show in its own way. The short answer is you would pick a manual like the Hygromantia or even the Picatrix or something that has daily prayers or invocations to the planets. So Monday is Moon, Tuesday is Mars, Wednesday is Mercury, and so on, right? And you can just use an app to do the planetary hour calculations because I am that lazy. I just said that about the habits. And so you sort of know that it's the first hour-ish after sunrise because the time between sunrise and sunset is divided by 12. And that's your planetary hour. And same thing for night, which means at the moment you guys have longer days, so your planetary hours will actually be longer than an hour, and mine are getting shorter. And you just kind of either have a space, I have a spirit room, obviously, but you either have a space where you just kind of quietly acknowledge sort of the governing planet of the day. And it's just really useful to think about the fact that we live on this. We all live on an astrological calendar, even if we don't realize it. Like the days are literally the planets, right? And it's just something, the medium-term effects of acknowledging or just marking this on a daily basis when people start doing it, the perception is their life kind of runs with slightly less friction. So it's almost like you become aware of, even if the planets, which they are metaphors for kind of like just currents of life going on. Like there's something about doing it or becoming aware of the general flow of life that makes it flow better. And so it's essential for people who do something like astrology or magic. But that's it. It's kind of easy. You don't need any special equipment or anything. You certainly can. Like I have mine's overly complicated, but this is what I do as a job. And you certainly can have like separate altars and they're pointing in the right direction for each planet and so on. But it's one of those things about magic in general, or meditation or whatever, that 80% of the value will come from that 20% first thing. You'll get 80% of the impact of even just quietly saying the prayer sitting at your desk, if that's the planetary hour. And then there's that other 20% optimization that you can kind of mop up by getting slightly better at it. But the most of the value is in just acknowledging it in the first place.
Yeah, that's well said. Makes sense.
Well, I think this is probably going to tirade. Oh, actually, no, I'm on the wrong question. Never mind. If I were to ask your best friend, what is the one thing they would say you need to work on the most and why?
It depends what day you catch him on, to be honest. I think at the moment, and this sounds like poor little me or whatever, but I think at the moment they would say self-care with the site and the books and the various dramas I've been through in Q1 and setting up the farm and so on. I've had this comes back to the habits thing, right? Like I could be living a little healthier than I am just from a workload and whatever perspective. So if you catch them on a day where they give a shit whether I live or die, and best friends generally, you flip a coin with that, right? It would be that. Otherwise, it would be they'd use more curse words, but I need to learn how to suffer fools a little bit better. But that would be it. It would, if they're in a good mood, it would be probably he needs to slow down at the moment. And if they're in a bad mood, it's like he needs to suffer fools a little better.
What are you most?
Both are true.
yeah, that tends to be the case. What are you most curious about?
I'm most curious about what I think that there is a global magic. I think magic is a culture-specific way of interacting with the fact that the universe is in some sense alive, right? And we haven't done a very good job historically of comparing, say, out of Europe and European cultures into non-European ones for a lot of historical reasons, which is the last 150 years of things like anthropology have been kind of racist and whatever. So we're at a stage in the last couple of decades where we're developing new ways of comparing things that we do or have historically done with cultures around the world. And I have this sense, and it just kind of makes sense, that there is almost like a global magic. There are things about magic that are universal, that are refracted or expressed differently in cultures. And every time we've tried to get to a universal level, like in the 19th century, it's been very hierarchical and kind of like, I don't want to say white superior, but like European superior. And so that interests me. And it interests me because I think if we can develop a conception or a good way of comparing across cultures, I think that says something about reality, and it also might make magic work better, because one of the long-running kind of like intellectual interests for people who are involved in magic is, why doesn't it work every time? Because it works, but why doesn't it work every time? And I suspect that insight will be shed on that particular question as we get better at comparing and learning from, in a non-extractive way, non-European cultures. So that kind of like wider quest for magic, if you will, is the thing that certainly interests me and drives me the most.
Can you share one of the more embarrassing experiences of your life with us? Honestly,
this was the hardest one, because I like to joke that I'm born without shame glands, which is kind of true. But embarrassing situations. So embarrassment seems to me when you do something human in front of people. So like you mispronounce someone's name at a party, or even worse, like your trousers will split if you're, in a meeting and you're presenting at the front of a boardroom or something. And I think about those, neither of those things. I've certainly mispronounced people's names, but like, I don't care. I actually, if you think about embarrassment, what it actually is, it's when you have demonstrated that you are a human and thus fallible, in a public setting. So I actually don't think I get embarrassed. I've been humiliated a bunch of times, which I think is worse. But I think embarrassment is sort of like, oh, I spilled like soup on my shirt on a date. Like, I don't care. That would be like, oh, this is a thing that happened. And if you mispronounce someone's name or something, you sincerely apologize. So I don't know. I don't think embarrassment is my biggest problem. But humiliation has certainly happened, and it comes back to workplace stuff. And humiliation's almost, it's a worse feeling, but it's better because it asks you to confront like who you are. So the redundancies have been very humiliating, and one of the good examples of that again was back in New Zealand at that formative early 20s, where I was a menswear manager for a kind of like luxury. This is back when I was thin and pretty and I could sell clothes. I was a menswear manager for a sort of large clothing store, and I was too young to have that job. Like I didn't get any training for it. Usual story. And so eventually, the store manager was managing me out, and it was really humiliating. And it was humiliating because she was horrible and she wanted to give the job to someone else. Fine, but by the same token, I wasn't that good at it. And so being humiliated in front of like the HR manager and the area manager and all this, as she was kind of like asking those questions that I didn't have an answer for because I wasn't doing my job properly, was humiliating. But it probably needed that humiliation because I wasn't doing my job correctly. And that was so the kind of psychological insight or medicine there is you probably can't do everything, and you certainly can't do everything without training or trying. So every time I've been humiliated in that situation, it's always been really useful as a mirror back on my own kind of psychological shortcomings, which was I was overconfident and not only I wasn't trained, but I didn't take the time to go and work it out myself anyway. So a lot of those really cruel things that she said to get me out of the business, it's not like she was wrong, she was just cruel. And so there's been situations where I've been humiliated rather than embarrassed. And it's funny, it's almost like that is the mirror that reflects on you. But embarrassment is reflecting out into culture or out into like, and I'm not embarrassed that I'm a human, and I'm not embarrassed by other humans. So if someone, splits their trousers in a meeting, I'm using that example because that in fact did happen to my boss once. And he was great about it. He's like, no, my trousers split. He went to pick up a pen. Like he put his jacket around his waist like that and said, oh, I guess I'm swinging home after this meeting. And no one cared. But if you get embarrassed a lot, there's some work you need to do on yourself, I think, there, because it's honestly just, as far as I can tell, humans make mistakes and you just sort of acknowledge them. And if you're around people who make you feel bad about something like that, jog on. They're not good people.
Yeah, that's a great answer. We might want to look at like changing it to humiliation. It's kind of mine was similar about the embarrassment. Like I don't really get embarrassed either, but my literal answer to that was trouser splitting in the gym in front of about 50 or 100 people playing European handball, and my pants, like as I was 15. That was embarrassing. Now I wouldn't give a shit, but mine was literally 15. The answer was literally trouser splitting. Yeah. It's
so maybe if you're a kid, you want to crawl into a hole and die.
Exactly.
We need to leave the country.
Yeah. That's awesome.
I'll make it embarrassing or humiliating.
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah.
Because actually sometimes people will have a really good embarrassing story, and maybe you want to hear that.
Yeah, exactly.
Robert Glover's was when he pissed himself on the plane. It was a fantastic story.
Well, so that would be it, because I was literally going to say, if you pissed yourself in front of the Queen or something, this is kind of funny.
Yeah.
And so you want to capture that for the show, but I think humiliation is more medicinal if you actually process what happens to you.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah.
What is your greatest fear and how do you overcome it?
This is almost like the embarrassment question, and I know it's a weird flex, but I don't get that scared of things. I'm certainly not scared of death anymore. And the things I like tend to fear. I like snakes and spiders and sharks and whatever. So I can't even go to a phobic level. Mm-hmm. And so I sort of sat with this question for a little while, and I think my biggest fear was living a prosaic life, sort of growing up in regional Australia and living a life that didn't leave regional Australia. was sort of middling, and that was my biggest fear. And how I overcame it was by having adventures. Essentially, you overcome it by overcoming it. Mm-hmm. But I honestly think my biggest fear, and it isn't even, and I was wondering if this was the case, it's not even a vanity like, oh, I need to be remembered, like I need to be a famous filmmaker and I need to be remembered or whatever. It's not even that. It's honestly, I was terrified of a boring life, it just horrifies me. And I'm definitely over that fear now. And I think, funnily enough, speaking in New Zealand, it was that rather than all the other subsequent adventures in sunken cities and whatever, which tumbled on from it. It was leaving Australia with a suitcase and my camera and 5 days accommodation booked in a backpackers in Auckland, and kind of showing up and trying to build. It was like a game show because the internet wasn't that good back then, and having to find a house and a job in those 5 days using a combination of really shitty classified websites at the time and newspapers. Those were like the best 5 days of my life, in many respects, because it was terrifying, but it was that absolute freedom of adventure. So I think my biggest fear this is such a flex. I'm sure I'll be scared of something else, but I think my biggest fear is something I've in fact overcome. And it was that having a prosaic life, because ever since then, like, my life is weird. It's not like it's heroic in an Aragorn sense, but it's certainly not normal. And I think that's what I was most scared of, for better or for worse.
I think that'll resonate with a lot of people. I mean, I think that's fairly similar with a few of the answers. I mean, that was kind of similar with my answer as well. It's kind of, not leaving any mark, or just sort of being, an extra.
Yeah, and it's
in your own movie, right?
Pretty much. It will be your fault if that's the case.
Yeah, and so many people fall into it where they're more caught up with some character in some sitcom than they are with what's happening in their own life. And they've just given all their personal power to the dude from, I don't know, Game of Thrones or whatever, it's sad.
So I think that's it. And I know it sounds like a bit of a flex, but I mean, like yourselves, it's not like this was handed to me. I worked on it over the course of several decades. So it's not like, I was born without fear. It's like, this probably is my fear. And after 20 years of attacking it, I no longer have it. And I think, we can take that win.
Yeah.
Well, it seems to be, because that answer's come up in different forms in a few interviews now. So it seems to me maybe it's like an inherent male thing, that it's just like, we have this built-in thing to just not be an extra in your own movie. And it seems like it's harder, and that might just be because of the times. Like, that probably wasn't that hard a couple 100 years ago. You're busy living life constantly. True.
But I also think, archetypally it's presented more as a male in the sort of Jungian sense, right? Although not necessarily. But I also think previous existences, you might be onto something there, had the opportunity for more of that kind of authentic engagement with adventure. So one of the things I enjoy about living in this context is, if I don't chop wood, the house is cold and I die. And that sort of, there's much more living authentically down here. Like, my neighbors will swing by with deer or wallaby that they've shot to go in the chest freezer. I'm going to join them eventually, but it's Australia, so you need gun licenses and all that kind of stuff, and I've been too busy. And I think the opportunity for the heroic, or for the overcoming of a dull life, you're right. We're there in, you couldn't not have an adventurous life prior to the sort of, not even late capitalism, but almost like mid or post-war capitalism and the rise of the suburbs.
Yeah.
Absolutely. What quality do you most admire in a man, and why?
So this is another question you want to phrase, because I want to say lower body flexibility.
Well, you know what? We should keep it the other version, because we had two versions of this question, and the other one was, what qualities should a man strive for in today's world?
No, I just wanted to make a gay joke, but I liked it. I think, I think it's a weird way of describing it, but and funnily enough, the qualities that we're talking about in a non-sexy way that I most admire in a man, I also kind of admire in like an older, like grandmotherly woman. And I'm trying to find the right description for it in the male sense. It's like a quiet self-assurance rather than a brash confidence. And I joke and call it like big dad energy. And the person who comes to mind is my builder. And he's actually a dad. He's got a couple of young kids and lives the next bay over. And he just inspired confidence by being around him, even though the stuff that he was doing, like he was a trained builder, he's a trained builder, but there were things that were new about this project that he didn't know how to do yet. And so he wasn't brash, like, I can do anything. He was just quietly like, we'll work that out. And there's just being around someone who has that kind of confidence rather than brashness. And also there's a what's the word I'm looking for here? It's vulnerable rather than brash. So I have a very locally famous black tiger snake that lives underneath the deck of the guest house. And I sort of mentioned that to him as he was pulling up the deck. I'm like, I'm pretty sure that's the hole where the tiger snake lives. And he's like, listen, if I see a tiger snake, I am gone. And so there was no bravado about it. We didn't see the snake, and he still built the deck around the snake habitat and whatever. He was just aware of it. And so there's some kind of quiet confidence rather than arrogance or brashness. And this is why I say it's almost a grandmother energy as well, because older women can inspire that same, like, well, I've actually pretty much seen it all at this point. And although I don't know everything, I'm sure we'll kind of like work out what's going on. But it is expressed differently in males. And that's, I think, the most admirable. That's the thing I admire most. If you can have that brash self-confidence that is a weird combination of humility and like get through itness. Again, we need better term. Maybe the Germans have a word for it. I don't know.
English seems to be the worst at it.
Yeah.
It's actually funny because I work with a Lebanese guy, and he mentioned that he's like, we have less miscommunication because we have like 30% more words. He's like, it's a thing. English is constraining.
It is. It's still less. We have quite a few more words in other European languages. It's just that the way German is structured means you can kind of connect them together and make ones if you don't. But the English, we steal. So, like in terms of Anglo words, there are fewer, but non-English words incorporate into English at a greater clip than they do into, say, French or something. So your Lebanese friend is right, but you can also say, yeah, but we're better at stealing. So
we're going to get there eventually.
Yeah.
We'll outpace you.
Yeah.
Who were or are your role models and why?
Do they have to be people I know? Is it like a mentor thing?
No, it can be anyone.
Again, like the ones that I do know are parents, and in particular, in a funny way, my mother, I think, exemplifies a lot of lessons to do with sacrifice and forgiveness and knowing when to bend and when not to. So she's this strange combination of an excellent mother, but also will just like turn around and casually stop tyranny. Like she's sued large companies and there was a sewage works near the primary school that I went to that built all these, treatment tanks, and they didn't cap them. And she's like, what the hell is this? And so she sort of like takes on these sort of random causes and sponsors nuns that she knows personally in Nepal and whatever. So she's a role model in a lot of ways about how you can kind of, when I'm in a good mood, mother's a role model. There have been people I've worked for. A guy, again, sort of like my next mentor 10 years later in London, who'd previously run like a private spy agency and so on. And his whole career is essentially being helicoptered into media companies to sort of do them up so that they can get sold. So he had all these and he was kind of like my first mentor, worked really, really hard, but in the end didn't care. Just kind of kept it really, worked really, really hard and made a bunch of money and lives in this sort of palace in Stratford-upon-Avon now. And he did not come from money. Like this was all him. And he just didn't care. And so like that attitude, there's almost like a Captain Jack Sparrow attitude to how he does life. So those are role models, I guess, that are kind of like in my life. Pete Carroll is from a combination of magic and life living and writing perspective, because the sort of trajectory of his life, he spent his younger years doing the boho thing, lived in India a couple of times building boats, lived in Australia and so on, and lived in squats in London and sort of experimented with magic and so on, and then kind of hit an early 30s moment and decided, whilst he still, does magic and is exploring his own kind of experimental physics stuff, he's kind of went home and built a successful small business and raised some kids and like writes his books and has his ideas and just kind of does all that stuff. And so in that respect, he would be almost like a professional mentor. The same thing, anyone who does magic and lives magic, like, and has the adventures. On the other side of that is Dr. Stephen Skinner, who has had a very different life and interest in magic to Pete Carroll. They're kind of on the opposites, but he's the same. Like, he's pursues degrees all over the world and lives in Singapore and has lived in France and had his own woods where he'd be doing grimoire experimentation and, publishes and translates grimoires and just lives all over and has adventures, but still. And I don't want to prioritize the money making, but by the same token, you do need money to live the life you want. And so people in a different way, Pete Carroll and Stephen Skinner are role models in the sense that they've managed to combine and indeed use magic to have that adventurous life that also has money.
Awesome. Yeah. That's excellent.
This will be a fun one.
It makes sense.
What institution of society or structural aspect of modern life would you change given the chance?
I think if I could introduce like a couple of lines of code or a script that could decentralize anything that could possibly be decentralized. So that would be how I would do it. So you could either introduce it at a federal government level or whatever country people are listening to this in, right? Essentially a policy that says, can this be decentralized down to a lower level? Because some things can't, the military can't, but most things can. And I think that would be a night and day change to everything, including you wouldn't get, and I mean everything down to local environmental improvement and all the rest of it. That would be it. Like we have a cosmic drive towards the centralizing, and God is in the decentral, as far as I'm concerned. Like that would be it. Rather than like, oh, I would want to make education free. That's not going to solve anything. Like it would be much. I would prefer to see, in some kind of like code insertion way, essentially a rule, can this be decentralized? If so, decentralize it.
Wow. Yeah, that's great.
100%.
Yeah.
I mean, that ultimate centralization kind of just leads to that like USSR sort of one guy's mood.
Absolutely.
Sort of runs everything.
Yeah.
And it's like, if he gets a crush on your woman or something like that, now you're in all sorts of trouble.
Yeah, well, it's the great warning of like Gnosticism or even the Tower of Babel. It's like centralization leads to destruction, and it does. And if you look at how living systems organize, it's a decentral system. So we're like out of kilter with the universe, and that is probably at the root of quite a number of our problems and risks and medium-term risks like war and so on.
Yeah. Yeah.
What is the most courageous thing you have ever done in your life and seen?
It probably is going to New Zealand, because and so I've sort of done that a few times. I have this perennial need, and it's coming back to that fear question. So fear and courage are obviously, courage is acting in the presence of fear, right? We all know the quote. If the life is at risk of being prosaic, I will burn it down. And so I think the first time I realized you actually could do that was when I bought a one-way ticket from Sydney to Auckland on my own at 21 and left my job and showed up to do that. I think that was the most courageous thing. Again, I've kind of done some, because I like sharks and snakes and things, like I've kind of done cool stuff like wreck diving and shark diving, but that's only courageous if you're scared of sharks. Like it's not really courageous. I enjoy it. I think it's, yeah, I think it was that first time I kind of like leapt into, admittedly it's just next door, but like I leapt into a foreign country without knowing anyone and without a job and without any money. And that was probably it. In terms of things I've seen that are courageous, and this is like, I'm sure, again, if you live long enough, once in Kensington, for instance, I saw a guy do that classic thing of pulling a little kid that had run out into the road. And he had to step the whole way out and do the spin thing. And just as a kind of bus was going by, and it missed him by, a few inches. So I've seen that. And let me that is courageous. Like, well done to that guy who saved some stranger's kid from being hit by a car, for sure. But I'm thinking about it more, and I think it's actually how my grandfather faced death. Because, he's dead and we got to see him die. And I think it was that. I think in his dying moments, and his last words were essentially, "I know God will take care of Joyce," which was, my grandmother, his wife. But that was the first time I'd seen someone die in front of me, and it was actually really courageous. And there was just a stoicism in how he did it. Hats off. I think it was literally watching my grandfather die, and his last thoughts were of his wife being taken care of rather than what the hell's going to happen now. Yeah. And that is hugely impressive.
Yeah.
Excellent. What rule do you have for yourself that you never break, and why do you think that it's important?
Honestly, that's one I would struggle with. Because you will always find exceptions. You'll always find exceptions to like ethical guidelines. So I'm not sure I haven't imposed a rule on myself that I haven't broken. Yeah, it's tough. Like, it's going to be something to do with regular magical practice. I'm sure of it. Like, it's going to be something like, well, I'll never not do magic, but I don't think I couldn't. Like, I don't think that would be a thing I could stop doing. Mm-hmm. So I don't have like a moral guide, like, I have all the normal non-psychopathic ones, like don't hit children and all that kind of thing. But I don't have like a rule that like I absolutely have to do that. It's a struggle. I'm pretty allergic to rules, not going to lie.
Yeah. Tends to happen.
That's a good answer right there.
Yeah, absolutely. Right on. Well, that wraps up the free section of the show where we go through the 13 questions. Of course, we had some fantastic answers here from Gordon. We're going to jump into the bonus questions here in the wrap up right away. Of course, if you want to get access to that, head over to 13questionspodcast.com today and head over to the sign up page, and it gives you a rundown of all the things we offer there, the communications courses and all that great stuff. Open sourcing the podcast. We got our first open source podcast sent in from Stevie in Scotland the other day, so we're going to drop that in the feed in a couple days. Yeah. Do all that great stuff. Thanks for listening. And into the bonus section, we got we're throwing an extra question into the bonus section just for you, Gordon. And that is,
shucks.
Were you a weird kid?
Absolutely was. Yeah. Sort of like I mentioned, hitting the reading milestones earlier. I hit the verbal ones as well. So I would. So I was precocious, I think, in the stuff I was interested in, and that kind of led to some unusual adventures. But like the reading, my mother's a psychologist, and my father's a psychiatrist, and they weren't sure what kind of like strange hyperverbal alien they had. Dad has some really fun stories. Again, Lord of the Rings ones, like. My closest friend growing up was this girl called Jessica, and they went through the Steiner School system, which I actually approve of, but the rules are kind of different about how you learn things like reading and writing in Steiner schools. And so my dad tells the story of him asking Jessica's dad. Jessica's dad asking my dad, is she reading? Was Gordon reading independently yet? And I walked by with the Lord of the Rings, like with my finger in it at that time, and so Dad didn't even say anything. There was another one when I was like 4 and I worked out, talking about beginners, you mean to continue. My dad grew up in the islands, so we'd go there every year. And I worked out we were at this Fijian resort. Maybe I was less than 4. It was between 3 and 4, close to 4, I guess. But the Fijian bar staff will actually serve me not alcoholic drinks, like fire engines and things. I could prop myself up at the bar. They found it hilarious. I don't even think they showed up on the bill. And we were there with a bunch of other doctor families, and one of them, Malcolm, walked by, and I said to this doctor, "Malcolm, can I buy you a drink?" And so these are the kind of stories. So literally hitting on doctors in a bar, beginners you mean to continue. But it was weird in that sense. So I was sort of hyper precocious. There was less. My school was haunted. So there was kind of like unusual spirit interactions in that way. But I also had hag attacks and other sleep paralysis encounters that may or may not be screen memories for things. And that is somehow implicated in how I found magic, because I had I remember the morning I woke up, but I don't remember the dream. At about 13, Saturday morning, bolt upright in bed, that I just had a bunch of weird dream experiences. And I got up, stole some money from my mother's purse, and walked the sort of several miles down to our nearest independent bookstore and bought a bunch of like magic books. And that was the beginning of it. And I know it happened in the dream. I just don't know what the dream was. And so that was kind of like my oddness, was interested in books and verbal, and then hag attacks and that kind of thing.
Wow. Did you manage to correct that, or not correct it, or heal? I mean, I don't even know what the right description is from the hag attacks. I mean,
yes, and they're actually very easy to do. House warding and general home protection are easy, and I mean that simply. You can spend a couple of minutes Googling and find something that that will do the trick. And in fact, mutual friend Greg Carlwood, one of his friends that I met at Greg's wedding the other year, had this into his in his late 20s now. And because usually it ends, the theory is, and it's kind of true, it's neurologically true, that different parts of the brain wake up at different times, and you sort of grow out of that as you grow into adolescence. Unless you don't, like this guy did.
Yeah.
And so he, per my advice, I'm like, just go to a local Botanica and get a house clearing kit. It literally does not matter which one it is. And yeah, he hasn't had them since. So
wow, that's great. Yeah.
It's easy to do. And it's not like I helped him with it. I just told him to buy something, right? He did that all himself.
Yeah.
So that was the same. Like I found magic at around the time that finished up. But so it's never happened since. There's been other kind of spirit encounters, obviously, that are side effects as you're kind of learning the ropes without a teacher, obviously, of how it works. Yeah, so that was the end of the weird childhood and the beginning of the weird adolescence.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, my girlfriend has had incubus or demonic attacks in the middle of the night. I think it's similar to probably the other version of the hag. And
it is if it's associated with paralysis, yes.
Yeah, and we've just started doing some protection magic, and it's really helped. Like stop two of them in their tracks, and her relationship to the whole thing has shifted ever since we've done. We tried a whole bunch of stuff before that, but it's almost exactly what you said.
Oh, then she'll clear it up because she'll clear it up because it is, as you say, related. It's not exactly the same, but it's similar enough. This is the case with the hag attack. It's my opinion, I guess, that they feed on fear, and that's what they're there for.
Yeah.
And the fear, it comes in stages where you sort of stir, and it waits at the edge of the room, and you become aware of it. Waits for you to notice that it's there, and to be scared that, oh, this is going to happen again, and then your fear elevates, and then it gets closer, and then you actually have the paralysis and have it near you. So once you've had a couple of times where you win, which your girlfriend's had, you can kind of interrupt it at that point, which is when you become aware that it's there, you go, get the fuck out, rather than, oh no, this is happening. And that's like, honestly, home protection magic, because I think it's deep in the experience of being a human, because, you know, we nest or live in caves or whatever it is. It's easy. And I mean, easy. It's literally the easiest magic. And you, so good for you guys. Like I have every confidence that this is the end of it.
That's great. Yeah. Went decades without being able to do anything about it. And finally it's shifted.
Breakthrough.
Yeah.
Well, we'll jump right through to the adolescent stages of Gordon and go to, what would you tell your teenage self?
Two things: have more sex, and you don't know everything. Because I really like that's that famous, I think it's Mark Twain, leave home before you turn 18 when you still know everything. I would say you don't, because I was overconfident with stuff, particularly magic. I'm like, you don't know everything, and have more sex. That's what I would say. Like, you can't have too much sex is probably how I'd phrase it. So I'm still having sex, but I look at it now and go, should I have more sex?
What turns you on creatively, spiritually, and emotionally?
It's in some ways a dull answer, but living systems. So I live here at the edge of the world, and if I'm feeling in whatever messed up way, I go and interact with non-human systems, and that is the parts of the woods that haven't burned down, and just being by my river and that kind of stuff. I can elevate that and make it more interesting, so that one of the things that I find particularly creatively exciting and look forward to is the sort of post. Like if you're doing heroic doses of mushrooms and up, You get your full kind of like prone lying down journeying experience, but then you're still high for a few hours, which is great. And that's a really good time to be out in nature. So I find that creatively enriching to be entheogenically altered and interacting with like the non-human world, particularly the plant world. But that is absolutely where I go if I need nourishment or enrichment is living systems and the more than human world and for sure.
Nice.
That's a great answer. You know what? And that actually makes me reconsider my answer for that question because I often equate plant medicine like psilocybin mushrooms to what other people are getting maybe out of going to church on the weekend and stuff like that. And if I do that 2 or 3 times a year, I feel centered, I feel connected to, you know, I feel less isolated in myself, all those sorts of things.
Oh, I'm a regular user in that kind of 4 or 5 times a year thing as well. I mean, I love it. I would also recreationally use it, I guess. But I won't ever miss a dose like that because that's my whatever it is that cleans out the anxieties and the depression and just makes you feel that kind of component to it. And it's so you get the journey bit if you're doing heroic doses, and then for whatever reason, it likes being amongst other plants and living systems. And this is an argument I did a solo show about this recently, but it's an argument for having an eye patch so you get the silent darkness, but doing it sort of like afternoon so that you do get to be out even at twilight where there's still light and you can be in amongst like plants and that kind of stuff. Because there's something extra about it that kind of like deepens its medicinal impact. But even without the mushrooms, nature or the wilderness or whatever you want to call it is where I go for that.
Did your experience in that regard change after your talking plant cognition and communication with Dr. Monica Gagliano in that book that you read of hers?
No, what I enjoyed about that was because we were in sort of full alignment, I think, in how I have this fantasy about how I want science to actually be done, and it isn't a dismissal of empiricism. It's recognizing that empiricism is only one method of truth validation, and so I sort of look around the world for scientists who are doing a kind of like post-materialist actual science, and she will like diet with the plants to get information from them, and she will still do lab experiments, but she'll be interacting on more than one level with them. And that was just like I thought it's a bit weird because I mean I know her a little bit, but it's a bit weird to put her on the like who are your role models, and I'm like, can I say Dr. Gagliano? It seems a bit soon. I basically just I'm glad she exists.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that book seemed to really have an impact on you, and I don't do the mushrooms, so I didn't know if I have in the past, but I didn't know if that would change. Like knowing that about plants would change your relationship while you're experiencing that. You know.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
What is your single greatest driving force in life, and what do you do to try and further it?
It will be again. It's some sort of, as I said, if it's a driving force, I guess I would call it the re-enchantment of the world. But it does come back to this kind of like oversimplified quest for magic idea, which is looking for and understanding how we understand. So again, coming back to the cross-cultural thing, and then understanding magic as it's expressed around the world, because and this is another oversimplification, but it's not like it's wrong, that basically most of the world does it better than we do. and I'm trying to, it's in that tension space. I joke about it all the time. I think I said it in this show actually. But like if I could be anyone out of any movie, I would be the guy from the EPA in the original Ghostbusters film who comes and shuts down the containment facility and floods New York with ghosts. Like that is basically my task in life. Like it's the re-enchantment of the world by any means necessary. So that's my driving force.
That's awesome.
Perfect answer. What do you most often choose to ignore?
Oh, this is so dumb, isn't it? But like realistically, it's like the medium-term health implications of a non-optimized life, right? So the usual stuff like you could drink less, you could certainly smoke less, but also even just the self-care stuff like I work too hard at the moment. I'm putting in that's my eternal challenge. And so I'm putting in stuff in hopefully policies and systems over the next couple of months that will go some way to solve that. But absolutely, it is driven people will always neglect that. And that's my shortcoming. And that will be my downfall, but it's also my current shortcoming.
What do you hope people will say at your funeral?
Did you bring the steak and mallet? I don't know. I like that question. I hope they say really bawdy things. Yeah, I hope they say really bawdy things, or even something like, "I told him not to eat that," or "I told him not to swim into that cave." Something that sort of makes you like, to imply that maybe you died spectacularly. And like, I'm kind of hoping. I mean, I come from a family. I thought it was normal. I come from a family that openly speculates on everyone's deaths, like at Christmas dinner, and it's some kind of like weird jungle Irish Catholic thing to do. But and we speculate about the kids, like, and talking about which of my generation's going to die first, and not like who gets what, but like I'm pretty sure you die first, and then what happens to them, and it's just like dinner discussion. And I sort of realized when I hit primary school that everyone else doesn't talk about death in this kind of like really open way. So I'm kind of, I'm not. The funeral isn't something that either scares me or that I think should have significant ritual importance, because I grew up in a family that's pretty open about death.
Nice.
What can you do today to improve?
Oh, where to begin? This would come back to not even work-life balance, but incorporating more, not even like physical activity, but being more mindful and embodied in how I live. I'm down here and we're still chopping wood and living in living systems, but nevertheless, like yourselves, I still spend the majority of my day at the moment. To be fair, we're heading into autumn, so there's not a whole lot to do. We're heading into winter, there's not a whole lot to do outside, but I am still not farming enough as I would want to. So it's sort of like work-life balance, but I think it's closer to I am not yet fully embodying, and maybe I never will, maybe no one ever does, but I'm not yet fully embodying all the things I believe, or my principles in life. So there's some kind of utopia here where I can spend the days, setting up the permi stuff and feeding ducks and whatever it is once this system is built, and incorporating that into writing books and doing the show and so on. At the moment, it's almost a work-life balance, but not at the moment. They're not aligned, and I guess everyone's kind of chasing their dream. Everyone's kind of chasing being in that kind of almost Yoda-like full embodiment and flow of all the things you want in life, and that's absolutely something I could work on.
Nice.
The final question: to what faults do you feel most indulgent?
I'm not sure, like, which ones in myself I forgive the most, or which ones in others I forgive the most. Like, is that what you mean?
It's more like which ones do you feel like you get pulled into the most? Which ones trip you up the most?
Oh, right. So, like, what are the vices that are the most difficult for me to?
Yeah, like mine's like smoking weed for sure. Like, I smoke too much weed, and every time I say I'm going to take a tolerance break, I can't even sort that out.
Yeah, mine's it'd be booze and cigarettes. In combination. I'm here on my own for most of the time, so I don't actually get that drunk. But nevertheless, there are some nights where I have, and that'd be it. Like, it's I will, and either drinking a little bit too much will pull in the cigarettes, or I'll be sitting outside enjoying myself smoking, and I'm like, no, I'll just go get another whiskey. And it's that everyone, like, it's definite. It is expected vices. It is alcohol and cigarettes are always the thing that I'm like, yeah. Should not have done what I did last night.
Yeah.
That's like when I was still drinking alcohol was always the gateway drug. That's the ultimate gateway drug to all sorts of crazy
all
behavior.
inhibitions go out the window, and
well, it's funny. Like, I think That's true. But there's sort of like a gateway drug to over drinking, especially when you're on your own, which is you can fall down like a YouTube or a Spotify hole, and all of a sudden, like this, when I say all of a sudden, this has happened maybe 3 times in the last year and a half, a bit more, 3 or 4. All of a sudden, I'm like, shit, it's 1:30 a.m. What have I been doing? I've just been like, this is a good song. I should listen to that. And I just stay up drinking and smoking. And I'm like, you got to get up at 7 to record a show with an actual professor. You should you should go to bed.
Yeah.
So it's that. It's definitely that. The food thing less so. It's booze and cigarettes.
Those are probably 2 of the biggest ones on the planet. So you're in good company.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, that about wraps it up. Big thanks for coming on the show. What did you? We like to ask our guests if there's any questions they think we should take out. If there's any questions they'd add.
Well, I accidentally gave an ongoing critique of the questions as we went through, which I didn't mean to, by the way.
No.
That's part of that's normal part of the experience, which gives us the ability to sort of keep modifying them as we go.
Yeah. So I think maybe just even that final question. That needs tightening because I wasn't sure, because it might even be, you can ask the vice question, but it might even be that if you're like, well, what do you forgive most and least in other people? Because that, even if that's not a bonus one somewhere in there, because that's kind of what I thought you meant. Because again,
and that's a great question.
If you ask my best friend, I struggle to suffer fools. So to be honest, like my first reaction, if someone isn't, and this doesn't even mean I'm smart, but like if someone isn't as smart as me, my first reaction needs to be checked. Like, because I'd be like, well, that's not their fault, and 2, it's not even a thing to get upset about. So I thought that was going to be where it was going to be. Where do you forgive most and least in other people? Because that's certainly a shortcoming of mine. But I like talking about booze and cigarettes too. So definitely keep the vice question in.
Awesome. And what any other? A lot of our guests have said it's spurred on a little self-reflection, or just the process of getting the questions before the show in itself was a unique experience. Did you share any of that?
Yeah, it was. And it did make me realize, because there's so many questions about inspiration and role models and so on, we're all kind of built by our families one way or the other, right? But it sort of made me realize what things I do and don't respect. Like, for instance, it had not occurred to me that I genuinely think the most courageous act I've seen was when my grandfather died and how he died. I thought, so there was some kind of really medicinal insights in terms of how I perceive my family that, for me, that came through the process. So thanks for that.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, awesome.
I love the overarching curiosity that you have about the global magic. I'm really interested to learn more about what you do with that in the next couple of years as we follow your podcast and stuff like that. And how that would play out, how that would work a little bit. Because it is interesting how, as we become more connected globally, there's also the metaphysical connection we seem to have with other people's practices. And I think there's going to be this real combination of, I don't know if best practices is the way to look at it, but common practices anyway.
It's almost like best practices. So here's the thing, how no one on the planet was better than India at developing meditation. They spent 4,000 years developing this technology, right? So they provably have the best. Now, if you're talking about
everything now, everything you learn seems to be about that now.
So let's jump across, a couple of oceans in that case, to South America and go, no one interacts with plant spirits, both consuming them and from a language basis, as good as about 4 or 5 tribes in the Amazon. Yeah. So they've got that. And then we can do the same thing with Australian Aboriginal songlines and how that works from an intuitive moving about the earth sense. And so what do I do? Because we've tried this before and it's racist and wrong. We tried it in the 19th century and we tried it with the New Age. We're like, oh, well, I'll have that. And I'll have that, and I'll have that, and I'll put them together in my white world. So that's not the way to do it. But nevertheless, India has the best this. And so here we are, and it's a big anthropological problem rather than just a magical one, which is how do we learn without extracting? And the reason I'm so interested in anthropology at the moment is they've spent the last 25 years trying to work out just how to do it, and they're getting all right at it. And so if we can kind of learn from them from a magical perspective, it seems like there is a way, some some people are better than other people at something. I don't not on a race-based level. I mean, on an individual level. So you look across the world, and some people are good at some things, and some people aren't. And what do we do? Because they all kind of work. How do these come together? And I don't think the answer is, one, ever solved, but two, even satisfactorily solved in my lifetime. Mm-hmm. But that's kind of like that. I'll never not be interested in that, and how we do that.
Yeah, it's like a weird form of networking almost, right? Like, how do you network those skills together? How do you get those people in the same room? I was having a conversation with Micah Hanks the other day about, like, we were talking about the great minds, you know, like, who are some of these kind of real forward thinkers when it comes to, you know, magic, intention, manifestation, healing, all that sort of stuff. And it's like, they're all sort of off on their own. They're kind of starting to come together in some sense, but it's like, you know, they're all so busy fighting against the current dogma and their own thing that nobody's kind of putting it together, you know, saying like, you know, why don't we get some sort of academy that's bringing these people together, or getting them in the same room, getting them working together.
It might work. I have no evidence to support this, right? But I just kind of think that if we get the pieces, and even pieces is the wrong metaphor, but go with this. If we get the pieces near enough to each other, they will kind of self-assemble like magnets. Mm-hmm. And so when I'm talking about sort of Amazonian tech and Indian tech and indigenous Australian tech and so on, I have no evidence for this. This is like the silliest, like, just guess, right? But I just kind of think that in an almost Voltron sense, that it will plug together and it will be like Earth's magic once this happens. Because it's weird. It's weird that the good bits, everyone has their own cultures and whatever, but you just kind of think, are we ever going to be properly multiplanetary until we find a way of, like, is it possible that like that the Earth has a belief system that is in pieces around the world? Like, who knows? You know, it's almost Gnostic and Atlantean in the sense that maybe we did used to be more coherent with our understanding of how all these things fit together, and at the moment we don't. Again, no evidence for that. It's just kind of like an idle speculation. But I just kind of get the feeling that if you put the pieces, if you can find a way of non-extractively learning, and those pieces get near enough together, it'll kind of like just assemble, and that's, yeah.
I mean, you could argue there's a little bit of evidence for that in some of the monoliths left around the world.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. We might be going back to what was already there, like you said.
Because, and I've written about this, and I'm very fascinated by the things that went on at that time depth. The thing is, the similarities are there, absolutely, and they're there either because of humans traveling around and interacting with each other, or because humans separated in space were in fact interacting with the same spirits, right? But it's weird. So you can't actually. You want to, because it feels right. You want to put it together into this worldwide civilization because it somehow feels right. And that's interesting. It's interesting that there is a universal sense. We don't have the evidence for it, and that doesn't matter. There's a universal sense that these things used to cohere. And that's what I mean by, I kind of feel like everyone has a sense that we all used to know this somehow, like we're broken, or there's a bit that's missing. And I feel like if we get the pieces together, yeah, it'll just
and maybe
it'll just all click together.
Yeah, and maybe Voltron is like a free energy type thing, something where it's sound and magnetism and meditation and plant all this stuff together that and what comes out of it is
the trees start regrowing and the oil starts sucking itself up. And
It's not even a thing, like, again, because there's no evidence for it, and I'm not even sure I believe this. I just kind of think it sometimes, if that makes sense. Like, that's probably how it would go. It's probably once we stop being dicks and you know, once we sort of realize that the universe is alive and everyone has things to contribute and so on. That's probably how the game ends, right? I don't know. I don't even know if I believe that, but like, sometimes I think it.
Yeah,
it's fun.
That's great.
It's fun.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks for coming on, Gordon. We appreciate your time. We appreciate
you
answering the questions. Once we'll release this in a couple weeks, and we'll send you all the links and all that fun stuff. And
sounds great.
And you're welcome to all the courses and everything else that's on the thing. If you want to check that out, we'll send you all that as well. So
fun.
Right on.
Well, all right, guys.
All right.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, have a wonderful day.
Time no chat. This was a good one. This is a good idea you guys have got.
Okay, good. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you very much, sir.
Okay, guys, take care.
All right.
Still live? Oh, I guess you're going to have to edit that out.
You're going to have to edit your bullshit. We're still live. We'll be back in 10 minutes with an intro. 15?
Yeah, I think 10 or 15, yeah.
We'll be back.
I'm almost ready. I'm pretty much ready.
We'll be back in 10 minutes with the intro.
Woo.